Welcome to the Worldbuilding Workshop, the companion podcast to the book of the same name. We did write it. I'm your co-author and co-host, Stephen Slota. And here it says the self-appointed Joe Rogan of the left.
Yes, that's right. That is correct. Trent Hergenrader with an 8.
That's right. And thank you all for joining us again, especially if you made it through the last episode where things did become a little bit more belligerent as the episode went on. Today, we're going to be focused on Chapter 11, which is about constructing the world narrative. And as we described at the end of the last episode, this will all be a focus on the meta-narrative lead and what essentially goes into constructing a world narrative, what a world narrative is, how you can think about the negotiation among learners for what it is they're trying to say about a specific world, and what you can do with these structures and substructures we've introduced in previous episodes to sort of bring this whole thing together and describe a world in language, using language to articulate what a world is or is not. I want to let my good pal Trent here wax poetic a little bit about what a world narrative is and how you think about this in your own world building projects as a lead in to us giving a couple examples of these things.
Yeah, so I mean, this is something too in which I get very nerdy about because it's essentially I see it as writing instruction. I get very excited about writing instruction. But the idea is, again, using Wikipedia as a model. I invite you to pull up your hometown or wherever you live now or whatever, like whenever you get a second, pull up a page of your favorite city or someplace you've never been. And what you'll find is what we call the meta-narrative lead at the front of the page, right? So it's, sort of before the fold in old newspaper terms. It's the part that's at the top that gives you the overview of the story of the world, sort of the narrative of the world. And then after that, on a Wikipedia page comes the table of contents and then all of the section 1 or heading 1 sections underneath that and all the subdivisions underneath that. And then all of that combined is what I call the meta-narrative or the story of the world. The thing that I really like about the meta-narrative lead is, especially when this happens more when I'm teaching fiction, but it also happens when I've been using this methodology for talking about our world as well. The meta-narrative lead, that top part, is usually, like almost always, between 350 and about 750 words. And it's like, okay, well, some, wiki editors or Wikipedians have been able to take a city like Rome or Athens or whatever that is, these ancient histories to them, and still be able to articulate what is most important about these places now, like in this moment. And then the history has a huge section, right? But if you only had 500 words to talk about Athens, what would those 500 words be? Because it's like the instinct is to make it go longer and longer and longer. And when you start looking at them again, the idea, more or less is when you're looking at the locations, when you're doing the world building, any location, if you can look at a country, you can look at a city, you can look at a continent or whatever, it almost always starts with sort of where it is in the overall moment of now, right? So if we looked at Rome right now, it wouldn't be talking about ancient Rome. It would be talking about contemporary Rome and where it's at, sort of this geographic location, all those kind of things. There's usually a lot about what the neighboring states are, what other geographic features are, then a short history, and then that's usually 1, maybe 2 paragraphs, and then something that's talking about where it is today or what it's known for today, right? And this is where, if you're doing a world building project, you always just got to make sure that that meta narrative is capturing everything at the moment that you've decided that that's where you're going to do your world building. There probably is, I didn't look, there probably is a page for ancient Athens as well as just Athens, right? But the goal is to say, I don't want to hear everything that you've learned. I want to hear about the stuff that I were to skim this, race through just these first 700 pages or 700 words rather, and then I could jump down to the sections that I'm more interested in, whatever. It's like that's how we all read Wikipedia pages. And it's it's like the old joke, if I'd had more time, I would have written a shorter letter. Right?
I was just about to mention that it's apocryphal, and people say Mark Twain said it. It's actually Blaise Pascal that said the mathematician and physicist. But I used to say that to my students all the time when we would go through this process, is if I had more time, I'd write a shorter book or a shorter letter.
Yeah. And then, from there too, normally what I would do in my world building projects is I'd say we're going to shoot for around a collaborative narrative around 5,000 words or so. You get that opening 350 to 700 and really resist that urge to make that opening overview 2,000 words or something like that. Or just keep it under 1,000. And again, I invite you listeners to go check out Wikipedia, and you will find time and time again. The exceptions are if you get someplace really specific, like a neighborhood or whatever may only have a few lines or whatever. But for the most part, it's not much longer than 750, maybe 1,000 words on the outside. And then the sections underneath, what I always say is, history is about 1,000, governance is about 1,000. Each one of these substructures is about 1,000. You add it all up, you should be somewhere in the neighborhood of 5,000, 6,000 words. The other thing, though, is that oftentimes some of these sections are going to be smaller and others are going to be larger, just depending on what's most important in that world, or like we talked about in previous episodes, what's most interesting to the students. So I think at the end of the day, what I sort of steer into is to cover all of this stuff well. 4,000 words is a little light. But then again, like how many people sit down and read a Wikipedia page from beginning to end? Like almost never. So, on the longer side too, it's like, well, just really kind of stick to the most salient stuff. You know what I mean? The stuff that would be interesting to your audience, your readers, which is going to be people who are working in this project, right? Unless there is some sort of outside project. But that's more or less the way that I structure it. Is overall, the goal is to have this number of words, and that can be whatever you feel is appropriate for your individual projects to get at the complexity. And they need to at least pay attention to all 14 of the substructures, even if they don't know much about it, or it's just a couple lines saying like, we don't know much about, this aspect, or we couldn't find it in our research or whatever. That's totally fine, as long as they account for it. Because as long as they write in, we didn't figure anything out about this, or couldn't find resources, that at least suggests that they went and looked and couldn't find it, as opposed to they just completely forgot about it. And this is one of the ones in which talked about this before in the fictional world building classes, where they're like, what's funny is if we're doing this for models, it's like sexual orientations or sexual identity or gender identity is like not anything that comes up in any of these other books or whatever. And I'm like, well, like, are you familiar with Shakespeare? Like, it's all over the place in Shakespeare, right? And then other times it's just like, oh, well, why do you think that is, right? You know what I mean? Like, why do you think that this was written out? Where obviously we get lots of interesting things from the ancient era in terms of these questions, and then it sort of, comes and goes with fads and Western sort of lit or whatever. So yeah,
can I ask you a question about that? So I'm curious how this manifested in your classes. It didn't come up very often when I've done world building in my own. Not to say that it never really came up, but we didn't do quite the same process you did. You were much more focused on a specific series or a specific universe. We were often just developing our own. So we had a lot of control over what those elements of the world looked like. When your students were evaluating this, were you asking them to infer a lot about the world building of a specific world? And if so, to what extent did they kind of invent things versus find the actual evidence in the text? I know in the book, in the world building book, we specifically say that in the case of The Handmaid's Tale, it's possible to infer some things and then have a good conversation about it, even if it's not expressly discussed in there. We said the same thing about Tolkien in one of these podcast episodes, where the gender identity that's associated with the various characters is not explicitly discussed because it's not something Tolkien was necessarily super interested in, other than, as you had mentioned at the time, the relationship between Mary as the mother and in the way he kind of thought about this through a Catholic lens. But you can look at what happens with Eowyn's arc in Return of the King, or the Two Towers in Return of the King, and you can see there are some very evident expressions of gender identity, and she even says, "I am no man." Like that's the big reveal when she kills the Witch King of Angmar, right? So like, how do you think about that and what you ask your students to infer from the text versus what they are creating for themselves?
Yeah, and also with Tolkien, it's like at the end of the day, all good women eventually get married, right? And it has
Like, you end up with this very specific lens of identity that he was operating under, that then is expressed, but he never says that was his goal, right?
So exactly. And I think that this is also where there are a lot of things that I'm sure in any creator's mind with the water of the world that they're currently swimming in. So when Tolkien is writing this stuff, it's just like, that's just his idea of what a good woman would have done. You know what I mean? They would have been smart. They would have supported their man. They would have stepped up in times of need. And then they would have supported the role of the family, like the matriarch of the family would have been like the role. That's not like his point. Like read the Silmarillion, read Lord of the Rings, and stay in the kitchen. But it's just like, oh, well, that's the good place for women to be, right? That's there. And it's like, okay, well, we can have problems with that, right? But it's also one of those things that this wasn't like an argument about this is the way women should act. Or it's like, they just happen to be characters, right?
It reminds me of another thing that we've said previously, although I don't think in this podcast, but I think it comes up in the book. At some point I had written this, and we may have edited it out. I don't remember what chapter it would have been in, but the argument that everything is political, not everything is partisan. And I think the structures and substructures sort of speak to that, where you have the relationship between politics and governance and rule of law and culture, and all of these different disparate elements actually are interconnected and intersectional. And so even if you don't expressly talk about them, they are inherently going to be a feature of a world, because they can't not be. It might not be They might not be important to the story you're telling. They might not be central to some character arc, but they are going to be present in some way. And I think you could do a good contrast with somebody like George R. Martin, who is actively trying to pick at some of this stuff, right? Like he's actually, and then you could argue that's actually his problem as a writer, is that he doesn't know how not to do that. He wants to chase these rabbits down holes, but The problem ends up being one of breadth versus depth, and if
And
it becomes
sprawl,
too deep, and then you get sprawl, right? So I think, how do you kind of constrain that or help your
yeah.
learners think about that?
Yeah, I think so. Going back to your original question that I got off topic, there is a lot of inferring, I think, but all of those inferences, I'm asking for them, like, where in the text did you get that, right? And this is where, too, a lot of times, even a small group, and this can often happen, if you've got a group of 20 or 30 or whatever, and you've got groups of 4 and 5, then oftentimes the person who has the loudest voice or is the most assertive is the one who kind of dictates, the way that everyone else is. No one's going to take this person on because it's not worth the fight or whatever. And then that's when, again, it's always good to have those class-wide discussions. Do we all agree on this, right? And it's like, oh, well, this was like a little thing that I interpreted to mean this. And then when somebody says that, and they know there is no right or wrong answer because it's all, what basis do you have? Then hands shoot up all over the place and say, I thought it was something different, right? So then it's like, okay, well, we don't actually get concrete evidence from this like short story which one of those may or may not be right? So then it's like, oh, well, to what extent is that open? Because we all have lots of different interpretations of texts and what they might mean or what they could mean, right? And you'd be able to arguments and whatever. And it's like, oh, well, if we don't need, this is one of the other things too, if we don't need to have a head-on collision where one of them is right and one of them is, or whatever, it's like, just, well, how well do we think that these arguments are supported? And I think people can smell a pretty lazy, or not very flushed out, or you're projecting more onto this than there actually is in the text. So there's a lot of that. And I think, again, this is where I was just talking about this, had another meeting with a colleague who's thinking about taking this kind of approach with one of her anthropology classes about global health. The thing is, just get them going on interesting conversations where they feel like they can legitimately sort of contribute to it. And I would argue, I mean, this is the meta narratives, whatever. It's the same kind of thing. Like if you get them in trying to articulate to a neutral audience, what would this world have been like, right? You know what I mean? Like they need, if it's like a boring, like we were talking about it last time, just plug it into an LLM and have it do it for you, right? But if you light that fire under them where they feel like they have something to say, they're not gonna want to use the LLM. They're gonna want to say, here's this niche thing, or whatever, and majority, minority, all that kind of stuff. So I think it's kind of like a trust in the process thing as well. And then also, I mean, the other things that I am always saying, like all writing, it's iterative, right? It's recursive. You write the meta narrative lead, and then you realize you missed something huge, so you go back and you revise it, or this doesn't belong there. So it's less of like I always say, you're not chiseling this in stone, but it's like you're writing something that can be easily, or you're writing it on a whiteboard, right? You can easily erase, write over it, figure out whatever it is, shuffling pieces around, and that is not a flaw. That is a positive thing in terms of, as you're revising, it's not just fixing typos and grammar problems. It's actually refining and becoming more specific. And this is where, I mean, as a fiction writer and as somebody who loves, creative writing professor, picking the specific word is a very important thing to me, right? Where it's like, okay, you've got the word, and you've got an object that is a large, right? That's a dull word. So then, like, what are the other kind of words that you could use? Is it foreboding? Is it, towering? Whatever. Like, you have more specific language that in fewer words will build the image in the mind of the audience. So that's where, depending on how far along you get, there's always refining that can be done for writing, right? So it's one of those things that I have a very sort of laissez-faire, I don't really care. Some groups that are working in certain areas may get their rough draft done earlier and start refining and start adding and whatever. And others may just kind of get a crappy first draft that's still sort of like disjointed or whatever. And as long as they get the main points out there, it's fine by me. Because again, this is like, we're not going to be sending this for publication. This is for our own purposes, for you to, as a process, start to construct how are you taking this knowledge and then putting it into your own words and building this world around it, right? If you're using an LLM, you're not using your own words. You're using literally everybody else's words, right? So don't do that either.
I think, the first thing I was thinking about as you're describing all of this is the scariest thing when you're writing anything, and I think this is true of regardless of whether it's rhetoric or it's creative writing or it's form generation or whatever, the scariest thing is having a blank page and just staring at it. And so I would always tell my learners, pick a thing about this world that you feel confident you can talk a little bit about. That you're going to start spinning off all of these different threads that then connect the spider web of the broader world. as an example, thinking about Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, which takes place in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and not every one of the substructures I think is necessarily readily apparent if you were just watching it as a form of entertainment. But by picking one substructure, and in this case, I think it would be pretty clear that you'd want to have a substructure specifically about drug culture, because the show is about Walter White and his descent into becoming a drug kingpin, right, making methamphetamine. And so there's a pretty obvious piece of the story you can kind of pick at there to be able to make some sense of the world. And then you can work backward to all the other categories, but you got to pick somewhere to start. And it's okay based on this process or based on this template, like you said, to go back and recursively edit. So it's okay if your meta narrative is not complete at the beginning. We just need something on the page to work backward from. And once you have that, you're going to be able to go through and more confidently say, here are all these pieces, how they fit together. So, what is Walter White or the drug culture's interaction with the rule of law in this particular corner of the universe? And there's another place I mentioned too. I kind of alluded to this with the mention of Sprawl and George R.R. Martin's approach to writing A Song of Ice and Fire, but you're really gonna need to think about what is the breadth and depth necessary for the world we're evaluating. Do we need to come at this with a meta narrative that is telling the story of the entire world's 40,000 foot view? Like in the context of Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, I would not recommend trying to evaluate all of the 14 structures and substructures through the lens of the United States or through the lens of North America, right? You could. Like, I think that's probably doable, but it's going to be a lot less interesting and a lot less specific and a lot more ambiguous in a bunch of different directions. Like that you can have the culture of the American Southwest and Northern Mexico. Sure, I think that makes sense. But if you're talking about what does Portland, Maine's governance look like in relation to Albuquerque, it's like, well, that's not really important for the thing we're trying to evaluate, especially because, as we mentioned in the book chapter, the goal here is to come up with a meta-narrative lead that is clear and concise. And I usually have tried to frame this as the same way you'd write an academic or scientific or scholarly paper. Like the goal of those papers, and if you've not done this kind of reading or writing before, it might seem a little awkward, and certainly it takes some practice to get used to, but you don't read an academic article in a journal from beginning to end, from top to bottom. It just is not the way you do it, because often, if you're coming at it, you already know some of the stuff that's in the lit review. You don't really need to review that. Usually the order ends up going from abstract to discussion to methods to conclusion to lit review, right? You're not actually following in chronological order of how it was written. And I think that the world building process is very similar, where it doesn't really matter where you're starting, because the audience for this isn't reading it like a novel. Their goal is to get the information necessary to solve a particular problem or write around a particular character. And that's going to generate from different parts of the world depending on the purpose of the audience member. So it's okay to kind of pick a specific thing that you're interested in and then figure out the intersectionality of all the other substructures around that, as opposed to feeling like you need to go through in list fashion from government presence to rule of law to et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
An equal measure with all of those things. Because I was thinking, like, this is one of the things, I hadn't thought about it before, but it's a really interesting question. Do we know what year Breaking Bad is happening in? Early 2000s?
It's post 9/11, pre-2010. Okay. Roughly the time period where Breaking Bad was originally released. So 2005, 2006.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think in terms of, like, you wouldn't necessarily like saying, okay, well, we don't need to start off with like planet Earth or whatever.
Sure.
I would think if you were going to be doing this kind of analysis, if you were going to be looking at Breaking Bad or any kind of text, so I mean, like, this is where it's not just about Breaking Bad. It's like, it would be interesting to look at North America, right? And what's the government's position about drug culture in these, in the three main countries in North America, and then zoom in a little bit. What's the forget Canada, because Canada is really not a big part of the discussion, although it's part of it. And then it's like, oh, well, where are these issues in Mexico? Where are they in the United States? And it's like, oh, well, it just so happens that all of these border states are the ones that have to deal with this stuff the most, right? So then you can zoom into New Mexico, zoom into Albuquerque, and then but I mean, like, they never go to Santa Fe, I don't think, right? Or Taos or anything like that. It's basically Albuquerque and then the middle of nowhere in the desert. And they pop into Mexico, here and there, right? I think. I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, and it's never particularly clear where in Mexico they are. There's a couple of times where they kind of hint at it. And in Better Call Saul, they do actually go to other places, but it's in a very specific context. So Kim Wexler is going to talk to a guy in Utah about how she's going to avoid the property fight over who has what land across the border, right? Like, there are some esoteric elements of this. Same thing with Saul or Jimmy McGill going to Amarillo in Texas, and they specifically choose some locations that are outside of Albuquerque, but broadly speaking, it doesn't change the dynamics or the intersectionality of all those substructures. It's mostly just a change of scenery for the sake of storytelling. So I would say the big picture remains consistent, even if those little minor episodes throughout change a little bit.
Yeah. And it's funny too, because even thinking about Breaking Bad, I mean, another tabletop role-playing game that I really enjoy is Cartel, which is it's basically plays a Mexican drug cartel. You take different roles within it and everyone's paranoid that they're going to rat each other out or whatever. But also like Narcos, if you've seen that, there's a couple, I can't remember how many seasons there are. I watched the first couple, where one is about the Colombian drug trade with Escobar, and then the second one is about the Mexican drug trade. And it's one of those things where the Mexican one specifically is looking at U.S. agents who are going from the world of U.S. drug law enforcement to the world of Mexico's drug and law enforcement, right? And it's like, oh, well, there are a different set of rules, and that's sort of the whole greenhorn on the set. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, well, yeah, we use torture down here. We, will kill witnesses, that are whatever. The cops are doing this. And it's just like, oh, wow, that's quite a bit different. And the only thing separating it's like a few hundred miles in a border, or what separates the way that these, even though the worlds of both sides of that border are being sort of depicted. And I think that's something, as long as we're talking meta narrative, that's sort of the same thing too. Like, so if we were talking about Breaking Bad, like, how would you want to spend the time to build the world of Albuquerque and then like the border, you know what I mean? And like the border, obviously government presence, rule of law would be super low because you're out in the middle of nowhere, you know what I mean? And it's like, a lot of that stuff wouldn't necessarily apply, like gender orientation or whatever doesn't fit in to that because there's no side of it. But it's just like, oh, well, what is that location? And that's unique. And like, why are they there? Well, they're there because there's no rule of law, because there is no government presence, because there's nothing, right? And that's precisely why they go to those locations. So just thinking about those kinds of questions in the context of different kinds of projects. And I mean, I always sort of default to historical. I'm, sort of like a English professor who wished he'd been a history professor. Although if I'd been a history professor, I probably wish I was a lit professor. But, thinking about those projects of what would be the most interesting things, and don't feel like everything needs to have equal attention, equal focus, because there's going to be stuff that's naturally more or less focused. And that's, if you've got an area like the middle of the desert, that's sort of an absence of a world because there is no society to it.
Yeah, and I think, not to go too far back in our podcast episode series thus far, but I want to kind of tie this back to chapter 3, which is the theory to practice chapter. And I think what we're dancing around here is the idea that there are going to be different use cases for different approaches to this, and the way you choose to do it is sort of dependent on your learning objectives, right? If you're going to do this for a particular reason, if you were going to have your students watch Breaking Bad, like there's probably a reason for that. It's not just arbitrary. Or if you were going to have them choose a world, you'd probably want to constrain that a little bit. But I would argue probably the most effective way to do this is to provide contrasting cases. So not just evaluating the world of Breaking Bad, but comparing that against the world of The Wire or the world of The Sopranos, because those, or Narcos, as you said, like there are a variety of reasons why you would want to draw attention to specific elements of those worlds that are relevant to each other, that they are going to be able to provide a clear contrast in some way, or that it'll allow the learner to be able to look at the invariance between those things and then say, okay, I get why the rule of law in The Sopranos doesn't match the rule of law in Breaking Bad. Or,
right.
I mean, you could even drill down a little bit deeper and say, well, rule of law in Breaking Bad is about the DEA and the relationship between drug enforcement versus these drug kingpins, versus the world of The Sopranos, where it's a much different organized crime unit that's interested in what these folks are up to, because they're breaking legs and collecting bribes and all these other things that just don't really happen in Breaking Bad. And that can kind of create a clarification for all the learners in that space that these worlds are not fixed in time and space for everyone everywhere. They are dependent, context dependent, and situated in a way that we actually want you to be thinking about when you go out into the world and you're thinking about these problems from the perspective of insert career path here, right?
And I think, to add on to that too, it's one of those things that, lest anyone think that we are confusing fiction and reality, we understand that Sopranos and Breaking Bad are fictions that are based on a historical sort of reality. So that could also be a kind of assignment to be able to say, let's think. And I'm thinking specifically about, like, in the world of the Sopranos, RICO cases and organized crime that is concentrated in the Northeast. What has happened over time? Why does the organized crime not have the same power as it did in the first half of the 20th century? All these kinds of questions that you could then say, well, how is that then depicted in a work of fiction? And that's what I would say about Breaking Bad too. Like, could you construct the world of what you think the United States or the Southwest would look like, and during the beginnings of the war on drugs or whatever, you know what I mean? And then go to, well, how is this then constructed in a piece of entertainment, right? That is not trying to be a historical document. It is trying to be sort of historically accurate without necessarily being historically absolutely precise. And that's one of those things too, in which I think, well, I've got some historian colleagues who don't really like the idea of doing historically accurate storytelling because they're historians and they only want to know just the history, right? I'm like, okay, well, there may be times that is necessary. And I think there are other times where it would be very useful to be able to say, imagine that you are a person living in this time. You know, like, what do you think would have informed your decision making? And that doesn't mean that you necessarily nail it, because I don't think anybody can ever really understand what it's like to be truly in somebody else's shoes. But if you can list, these are the social forces that somebody like this would most likely be experiencing, and a person with this demeanor would most likely take these choices, right? It's like, oh, personally, you know, from my own training, I think that would be a huge W, a huge win, if you can get your students to go through that process, right? Where it's like, I could imagine other alternatives, or I could imagine somebody who we don't know what they would have been like, without necessarily, and this is where too, like the role we talked about this last time, the role of the instructor is to be like, I don't know, you know what I mean? Like that seemed like, why would you think that this character would be able to, like, you know, or this person would be able to operate so far outside what everybody else is doing? Like, what's the story there? And like, if they can come up with a convincing reason, then sure, you know what I mean? Like, oh, well, there's always going to be some outlier, but yeah, and it's like, oh, well, if that were common, then there would be more people who would have done it, and we wouldn't be talking about this, right? So again, the whole question, I mean, as we keep coming back to, like, what is it that you want to get out of the project, out of the narrative, out of the things that you're using? It just goes back to, you know, you said many episodes ago, you really just got to be thinking, what is it that I'm doing in each moment to try and get towards the learning that I want them to take away? And it is, I don't want to be like touchy-feely, like, you can feel it in the room, right? But it's like, you can kind of feel it in the room, right? Like, people don't need much prompting. And if there's a group that goes quiet, you walk over and say, where are you at? You know what I mean? And sometimes it's like, oh, we just got done with a really good conversation. We're all taking notes, right? It's like, okay. And other times they're like, yeah, we don't really know what we can say about this because we didn't see there was enough evidence, right? So it's like not worrying about, oh my God, am I going to assess them for a poor performance because they weren't talking much today, right? And rather, like, let's think process over product. The product needs to have a certain quality to it, but that's not, if it's, you know, if it's a little bit unpolished or whatever, that's okay, because the most of the work that we're asking you to do is during the process, right? So, and that
I would say,
yeah, go ahead.
Well, sorry, that immediately made me think. Like, I want to let the listeners know, like, much more often than not, my students would have too much to talk about and not enough. Like, this is not a situation where often I was surrounded by silence. Like, there was plenty to deconstruct, and these discussions or arguments or debates could go on about any given topic in the world for a long time.
Yeah, forever,
right? Like, and I think, you know, going back to what you were saying about the historians who are, you know, the historians, you know, who are most interested in getting the most historically accurate whatever, right? That part of the benefit of doing this isn't just that you're able to tackle the learning objectives associated with the course, but also you're teaching literacy. Like, this is a way to teach digital literacy, information literacy in any subject area, right? It's a universal skill that you really do want the learners to work with. Like, you want them to practice these skills, because whether they're going to be a historian or not, they're going to be bombarded with information in the form of entertainment all the time. And we mentioned this in the simulation chapter, and I'm sure we'll come back to it, but Assassin's Creed falls in this category of a video game series that is loosely historically accurate, but also it's clearly fictional. And we want learners to be able to engage with that in a thoughtful, intelligent, critical way, not just assuming that these things are correct, or not able to identify where the variance and invariance is between what they're seeing in Assassin's Creed versus what they're seeing in a Ken Burns documentary versus what they're reading in a primary source document. And I keep thinking about this. There was a post that you had shared a few days ago, or shared yesterday, I think, about Andor and the sort of uncritical consumption of that as media. Now, I know we keep saying we're not going to go back to the well on Andor, but it's just a really useful example here where the entire series is about rebellion and the evolution of revolution in a fascist state. Now, if you are consuming that, assuming that it is completely disconnected from reality, you've kind of missed the whole point. Like, the argument that Tony Gilroy and the other folks who created the show are making is that, number one, fascism is bad to live under, right? We don't want to live in fascist authoritarian states, that dictators are bad. And second, here's the toolkit you need to undermine a fascist authoritarian state. Now, we don't expect anyone to read it literally. Like there's
Right,
no
right.
argument that this is a historical depiction of events, but the showrunners did draw on real history to make these points. And I mean, George Lucas has been very blunt about the fact that Star Wars was based on the Vietnam War, right? And that
Yeah,
the
Nixon, and yeah.
prequels are based on the rise of hypercapitalism, and the even the trade disputes are relevant to the
Yeah.
world we live in. And we want learners to be able to consume that media in a way that makes them go, huh, that actually sounds a lot like X or like
Yeah.
Y, or
Yeah.
this makes me feel or think this. And isn't that kind of the point of all art, is to make you
Yeah,
think and feel
you'd
things,
hope.
right? Like,
One would hope.
so that's
Yeah,
what I
and
go back to when we talk about this, is just this idea that art is meant to serve that purpose. The humanities serve this purpose of making people critical thinkers. And we even say in the book subtitle, we want people to be more empathetic and to think more critically. This is why we think that world building is a vehicle to do that.
yeah, and that's where, one of the things too is you've been talking. It's like, thinking about more specifically in the Star Wars world, The Mandalorian. But I'm a Western fan. Like as a genre, it's one of those things where it's like I'm not like a huge like sit down and watch a bunch of Clint Eastwood movies because I love the Western. It's the Western as a genre to define what the United States is and what westward expansion was. Like I find it absolutely amazing. And it's like you need to know a little bit about the way, because if you don't know anything about like buffalo hunting, and it's like, oh, these people are out there, buffalo hunters and blah 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 blah. If you know anything about buffalo hunting, they basically are big dumb animals that if you are downwind from them and you shoot them, as long as you take your time, you could drop them one after another and they never stampede, right? It's like they're just dumb. So as long as you take your time, you did not need to be as skilled. It was a very low rank kind of thing, right? But then when we get the look at cowboys, it's like, oh, well, they're riding through stampedes and, lassoing or whatever. And it's one of those things, again, in which it's like, oh, well, this is not art imitating life. This is art trying to create a reality that was never there, right? I'm coming in a very wide range. Like whenever there's new sort of westerns out, I remember when I was in high school, I loved Unforgiven because it was like one of the first of the genre that was like really questioning what are the values in westerns. By Clint Eastwood of all, like I would never imagine that Clint Eastwood would make that movie now. But I just watched, I think it's Bone Tomahawk, not that long ago, and again, it's one of those things. This is the same thing with the Andor post. People are like, oh, well, those are some negative depictions of the natives, and it's like, do you have a critical faculty in your head at all? Like that's the whole point of the movie. It is a critique of all of these stock items that you will see in the Western, and it's supposed to be offensive or questioning or weird. And it just one of those things that I love to do, along with finding my favorite books and reading the 1-star reviews on Amazon, which is another weird hobby of mine. Like I just love reading reviews from people who hate things that I really liked, or really, it's like, that's how I like to make myself mad. But in this particular case, that's what I was thinking is like, you've got a very surface level understanding of what this is with it's all text and no subtext, right? And that's where I think what we're talking about here is, as we're talking about, you're trying to put into language and using the language of most people, some people, many people, hardly any, you know what I mean? Whatever, to have those sort of qualifiers in there. But it's about trying to get to the fact that this is not just a layer. I mean, I just sort of bumbled into this metaphor, but it's like strata, right? Of like a geologic thing in which it's like there are all of these layers to it. And again, at what level, at what point does any of it matter to you? Well, I don't know. You need to know what happened yesterday and the day before and the day before, and like where you want to draw that line is kind of up to you, right? But that's where, again, being able to use language in that way after many years, centuries past, you know what I mean? All those kind of things. I don't think we were talking about this. I was talking this about somebody else, that we've got this, especially in the way that U.S. history tends to be taught in K through 12, is blah, 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 blah. And then there was Columbus, and then blah, blah, blah. Then the Pilgrims came, then blah, blah, blah. We had a Revolutionary War, then blah, blah, blah. Then we had a Civil War, then blah, blah, blah. World War One, right? And it's like an Industrial Revolution in there, right? And it's like, there's a lot happening there's lifetimes that are happening in those blah, blah, blahs, right? And that's where, who knows what blah, blah, blah we're living in right now. You know what I mean? There could be something massive that's going to happen in the near future that's going to change everything. And yet we're all naive of that in this particular moment. And I think that that's where trying to capture some of that stuff in language is sort of useful, right? You know what I mean? In terms of being like, okay, if you want to be able to say not a lot happened over these 20 years, you know what I mean? Like you'd say, 2 decades passed with little advancement or something like that, right? So there's ways to account for those changes over time without necessarily having to really sort of dig into all of those details.
I keep thinking about the fact that this isn't an exercise you do because, as we said before, it's not because it's fun necessarily. It can be fun, but the whole point of this is to apply Enlightenment principles to get people to understand that they are one person among many living through this continuum of time, time being sort of fourth dimensional, that all of us are passing through it. And all of the events that preceded the current moment will affect what's happening now, just as what's happening now will affect the future. And these are not, as is often taught in K-12, instances where everybody at the moment a thing happened was prepared for that moment or knew the importance of that moment or understood what the future would portend based on what was happening there.
Right.
So when we're asking students to construct a meta-narrative lead or a meta-narrative about a particular world, and it doesn't matter if it's fictional or nonfiction or real, the entire purpose of this is to get them to stop and think about, what am I doing right now that will have ripple effects down the road, and what events of the past led to me being in this current moment, so that they can be more thoughtful about what are they doing that is actionable in the world, what will make a difference, what could they be doing, or what weren't they doing. And you often hear, I like to think that I would have been a hero at X point in time. I would have done the right thing. I would have made this. It's like, well, okay, let's pause on that for a second, because in this sort of historical revisionism about what would have happened in the past had you been there. And it's like, well, what context would have existed there? Would you have even thought about this thing? Could you have understood what was going on? Was there an information ecosystem that would have allowed you to understand what was going on? And trying to get the students or the learners to think more about what their positioning is vis-a-vis all of these different structures and substructures, instead of assuming that these things are under their control, instead of them being sort of inheritors of those social forces, as we've talked about before, and that being the thing that precipitated them in that moment thinking, well, of course I would have been this kind of person. It's like, not necessarily. Like your life world is what's dictating the way you think about this right now, and your life world would have been different in the past. I've thought about this in my own family. Like, I have ADHD and I'm on the spectrum, and I've wondered, like, what if what we know about these things had been known 100 years ago? How would that have changed the lives of my grandparents or my parents? How would they have thought about themselves, and what would their identities have been? What decisions would they have made if they had known all of this at the time? And I think it's really easy for us to project into the past what we would have done, or even project into the future what we will do, without necessarily understanding what those social forces are doing around us. And that doesn't mean that by going through the world building process, you're going to somehow become enlightened to the fact that you can solve all these problems because now you see the world in a way that is multidimensional, right? I mean, I like to think that enables you to see things a little bit clearer, but we are not, as we said before, none of us is privy to all information all the time. And we're always going to have to stop and think about, what do I know? What do I not know? What do I not know? I don't know, right? Like there's a lot here to sort of unpack. And I don't want any of my learners to come out of this process thinking they know everything, but I do want them to, as we've said before, ask good questions about the moment they're in. The only other thing I was going to add to that is there isn't so much a difference between what you're doing with historical reality versus what you're doing in fiction, because the goals are largely the same. And I think the structures and social forces will transcend whatever it is you're evaluating. I often use this as an opportunity to talk about authorial intent and death of the author in the context of fictional worlds, but that's not irrelevant to what's happening in reality either, right? Like who has control of information flows, what is the reason why they have it? This is why I've said before that I would show my students or talk to my students about manufacturing consent and why it matters, where information comes from, who the editorial decision makers are. This is kind of the whole point of our last episode about Wikipedia. Like, should information be centralized or decentralized? And then what are you going to do with that information once you have it? Whether it's something fictionally created by an author for a specific purpose, or you going postmodern on that thing to deconstruct and read into what the author wrote, what they didn't necessarily mean for themselves. So all of that applies across whatever medium you are using to do this process.
And I think, another thing too that I would throw in just as you were talking, because this is one of I don't really gripe hard on it, but I tend to sort of feel like I'm rubbed the wrong way when I'm seeing anachronistic things, especially in sort of medieval fantasy and things like that. Like I think I talked before about how Arya Stark in Song of Ice and Fire would not have had that conception of an identity without modern psychology, and there's no suggestion that modern psychology has happened in the world of Game of Thrones, right? So it's like you just don't naturally. Cave people didn't have that conception, right? People in the 13th century didn't have that conception of being an individual. And I think that this is also where, putting my media studies hat on, like when you start thinking about, well, why was Gutenberg such a big deal? Right. And it's like, okay, well, for the first time, you could mass produce print material to get it out to the masses, that it's like you are good enough to read by yourself, right? And what we're going to also do is teach you to read, right? So it's like massive sort of upheaval, where if you go just a few years before, and it's like, oh, well, very few people were literate, right? Very few people had books. And it's like, oh, well, this is a case in which the technology creates a huge ripple in the society, right? It's one of those things that I was just having a conversation with another colleague about this, about how it's not one directional. Technologies are developed by the society, and then the society is influenced by those technologies. It's always a give and take and a back and forth, right? And that's a case in which it's like, that's why you want to be able to say you can't trust that your students who are undergrads, for the most part, are going to understand why Gutenberg was such a big deal, or why the internet, right, is such a big deal, or any of these things. And it's like, you do realize when Thomas Jefferson sent off Lewis and Clark, there's like a good chance he was never going to hear from them again. You know what I mean? It's just like, there's no email. There's no, I'm just going to shoot you a text, Tom, once we get over the Rockies, because they didn't know the Rockies were there, right? And it's like, well, who knows what happened to those guys? They left, you know what I mean? They left in whatever year they left, and we never heard from them again. So it's those kinds of things too that I think are really useful about just taking a minute to build that world and be like, forget about what you may not even be making these assumptions, but they may just sort of be bouncing around in your head that you've never had anybody come out and say, yeah, it took a week for a letter to get from, Ohio to Washington, D.C., because that was rough terrain and there were no roads, right? Like, that's just something that maybe somebody wouldn't have thought about. And that person waiting for that message may never get it, or it may get intercepted, all those kind of things. I'm thinking specifically about, some of the Revolutionary War tours that we've been on, and just, or the Civil War stuff too. And it's like, if they had a drone, all of the either side had a drone right there, like, oh, we know exactly where the enemy is. They're over the, it's like, oh, well, they went way out of their way because they didn't know where the enemy is.
Well, riffing on the Gutenberg thing and the literacy rate thing, like we talk explicitly in the book about the American Revolution and sort of the historical context for that. And there's a reason why we keep going back to Colin Woodard and his notion of these 11 independent nations that make up the United States. And these nations are not actually defined by geopolitical borders. They're defined by cultural borders. Yeah. Well, we open the book talking about the history of education, and that the reason why puritanical New England was the way it was and ended up with the politics it has now in the 21st century is derived from exactly what you were just talking about. Yep. This idea that literacy became a focus of this subset of the population that was not shared equally across all parts of the population, but because New England was settled by this particular group of colonists, they brought those values with them, and that influenced the way that those societies developed relative to other societies on the same continent, relative to the societies that were already here on the continent. Like, that we're talking about this sort of, you to use the example of geological strata, but it's kind of like when you have two different tectonic plates run into each other, right? That you have these various elements of the various structures and substructures and social forces that will eventually come into conflict. And so when we see the Civil War happen in the United States, well, that's one of those moments where those tectonic plates hit, because the various cultural milieu of the various populations that existed above the Mason-Dixon line, right? Yep. That those groups of people held different values that were in opposition to those of the people on the other side of that line, largely, right? And I'm generalizing here because that's obviously not true of everybody on both sides, but that all stems from, or at least partly influenced by, I wouldn't say it's all a result of this specific thing, but Gutenberg inventing the printing press, right? If that hadn't happened, that linchpin moment, you would not have seen the same development of those same cultures that then ended up coming into conflict hundreds of years later. And I think that's what we're trying to get at here, is that these things are really complicated and multidimensional, and that's why we want the learners to kind of go into this thinking that actually maybe this wasn't inevitable, or maybe it was inevitable because of these forces that were created by this specific moment or this specific invention or this specific idea. And we talked about this last time too, the notion of Enlightenment principles. Obviously that had a huge effect on the evolution of what we now call the United States, that had it not been for the likes of Thomas Paine, we wouldn't be here right now. Or maybe we would, and somebody else would have come up with this idea, and those ripples would have happened in some other way, but it would have inevitably changed the trajectory in ways we can't necessarily predict because of the fact that all of the, this is reason also why throughout the book I repeatedly wrote in references to Ian Malcolm from Jurassic Park, because he's a chaotician, and it's just this whole shtick, right? This idea that you can put a drop of water on somebody's hand and it'll fall down in different ways based on your pulse and based on the orientation of the fine hairs that are on your skin. Like all those ripples and grooves and things that are causing their trajectory to be what it is, they are only like that at a given moment in time. And if not for that thing, maybe it would be different. And anyway, like I don't mean to go on this whole digression about it, but we do exist in this chaotic paradigm where any one of these moments could be worth interrogating because you can ask that question, what if? And this comes up, I think, I don't think it's this chapter, it might be the simulation chapter, but we talk about doing these simulations or thought experiments where what if Lincoln hadn't been assassinated? Or what if it hadn't been lethal? If he hadn't died as a result of that wound? What would have happened with Reconstruction? What if Andrew Johnson had never become president? What if Reconstruction had been successful? What if Sherman's march to Atlanta had ended in a different way, right? All of these things. And that's just one specific event in one specific geolocation,
right,
ignoring the rest of reality, right?
Yep. Yeah, no, exactly. And I think this is where, too, I've been thinking as we've been talking that, we've got the name of the book, obviously, the subtitle of the book is Teaching Critical Thinking and Empathy Through World Modeling, Simulation, and Play. And one of the things that we've talked about in the earlier episodes and in the first third of the book is about how contextualized, situated learning is really sort of powerful. And this is one of those things that the world building stuff alone is powerful. It's even better when you're like, you are going to need to do something with this after we get the meta narrative written, right? So it's like, this is where even if it's just like a day-long exercise or something, like, it doesn't need to be a huge thing. We'll talk about different options more when we get to the simulations and role play. But I do think there is a motivating factor that if you were going to have to, on the fly, determine how a randomly generated character, for example, might think about the world in the world that you're building, that gives you the context for why are you building the world at all? Like, why are we going about this project? We're going about this project because you need to figure out all of these things, because what happens if you get someone who is a soldier or who is a seamstress or who, you know what I mean, wherever they land within like, you need to know how all of those people would realistically sort of, in it, or at least be able to come up with some sort of explanation as to why you think they would take a position or what their goals or what their motivations might be. And this is where, too, like this assumption, when we go back and we're talking about the founding documents for our nation, too. And it's like, oh, we believe, all men to be equal. And it's like, okay, well, what kind of men? Well, it wasn't men of color. It wasn't woe men, it wasn't women, right? It was basically land holding white guys is who we mean, right? And it's like, okay, well, that's a little trick of the language there, isn't it? You know what I mean? It's like, oh, well, this was never going to be absolute equality for everyone. And that's where if you want to be a constitutional, I don't know what you would call it, traditionalist or whatever, it's like, oh, well, they said originalist, yeah, they only meant men, right? And it's like, I don't think that's what they meant, but that's the way the language was at that time. So just sort of, thinking through, I guess, that part to go back where it's like, if you're saying, hey, look, we're going to do this world building project, we're going to take X amount of days or class periods or whatever to do it, because at the end of it, we will be doing this, right? Like even foregrounding that, I think, generally speaking, the idea of like, I want you to do some research and then come back and tell me what you think the world looks like in your own words, generally, I find to be super motivating for students without much more. Once they know that there's going to be some sort of simulation where the situation changes in some way and they're going to need to be able to account for it, or there's the additional motivation that they may need to play act as, some sort of character in the world, then it like even increases that desire. And there's often sort of a push-pull in which is like, we want more time to work on the meta narrative because we want it to be really rich and deep, and have all of these things. And on the other hand, it's like, I want to hurry up and get to the outcome, right? And then like experiment and play in the sandbox, whatever. So, and it's like, you get different mileage out of different students, but generally speaking, most people are most engaged most times. And I think we've said this before. It's like, and it's almost pretty much always better than what the alternative was, lecture and quizzes, you know what I mean? So it's like, even if it doesn't work great, it probably is working out better than going through a slide deck and talking for 55 minutes, right? So,
well, and it's useful for designers, I think. We've talked a lot about teaching K-12 or teaching higher ed. I often deploy this in the context of instructional design or in the context of pre-service or in-service educators. So there are people who actually want to learn. I tried to learn about world building so they could go do it on their own. And one of the reasons why, in particular, crafting a meta narrative was useful is because that was an opportunity for them, speaking of goal orientation, to say, what do I want my students to learn when they do this? How can I align the meta narrative that I'm writing about this world that we're going to use in my classroom? Like, what can I do to create that one-to-one ratio between sort of the meta narrative lead and the learning objective I'm trying to achieve? And if you map those things well, then it should follow that the learners who are engaged in whatever creative activity you have them doing in that world will come out of that process being able to do the thing that you want them to do, the same way that we talked about back in the chapter, that sort of missing chapter about gamefulness, playfulness, and fun, that you're trying to create a one-to-one ratio between a play objective and a learning objective. The same thing is true here. So this would actually be kind of a point of confusion with those people when I would teach this, because often they would come back and say, well, I don't get it. Is the meta narrative lead about the world, or is it my objective for the world? And I'd say it's the same, right? Those two things are actually identical if you're doing this in a way that is going to be instructional versus just doing it for creative writing purposes or doing it for some gaming purpose or whatever. That you can do this strategically. You can write your meta narrative strategically to make sure that it's giving you the supporting structure, the scaffolding you need to implement some specific instructional activity. So I just wanted to put a note on that, because I think if you've been listening to this thus far and you're not a K-12 educator, or you're not a higher educator, and you're doing this for a corporate environment in the military or healthcare or whatever, it's still valuable because you're still going to be able to draw a parallel between what the world is that you're creating as a group and the thing you're going to do with it afterward, whether that's building the world of a hospital or building the world of a military unit or building whatever. Like it's still cross-applicable.
Right. And that's, along with that too, going back to, we were joking earlier, like I kind of like it when students are like, we got our meta narrative done and it's 1,500 words, right? And I'm like, okay, now divide by 2. Right? Like you've got to decide out of those 1,500 words, because that's twice as long as I ask, right? You know what I mean? So it's like, you need to bring this down and tell me what is the most important, right? And it's like, oh, well, all of it's important. And I'm like, I'm sure it is. But like, there's got to be some tough decisions that you're going to make, right? And this is like, again, like being a writer. We had to cut this book down. When I wrote my first book, I had a whole bunch of material that I needed to throw out because I wasn't going to be able to get to the other stuff that I want. And it's like, that's a skill that we all need to learn of, like, look, if I had a day, I would spend all day talking to you about this, but I have an hour, right? This is one of the things that I've noticed in academic job searches. The people who really understand that job talk is a 40-minute talk and a 20-minute Q&A versus the ones who are just sort of like blathering. We've had candidates who've gone well over their time and I think they, at least this one person who's in recent memory, I think you think you're nailing this, right? Because you're going on and on and on and on. And believe me, you're not, right? You know what I mean? Like when we said 40 minutes, we meant 40 minutes, not 70 minutes, right? Or whatever it was. So just, I think being able to get students to sort of see too, like, this is definitely the case in creative writing. Quantity is not better than quality. It needs to be a balance between you've written as much as you need to write in order to achieve the objective that you had, right? And it's the objective was not barf out everything you've learned about this, right? The objective is we're trying to create sort of a shapely narrative. Some parts will be longer than others, but more or less it should look the same. You know what I mean? Like when we're moving between these different worlds and these different projects, it should look kind of the same, or at least resemble the same thing. And if your meta narrative lead is twice as long as everybody else's, and there's no example on Wikipedia that you can find, then that's suggesting that you can do that work, right? It may not be used, you may not understand how to do it right off the bat, but that's why I'm here, right? I will help you start to say, I don't think that's as necessary.
We've complained a lot about efficiency in the last couple of episodes. And I think in this context, I was thinking, well, are we arguing that we want them to be more efficient with language, which I guess is kind of true, but I actually think it's more about concision and precision.
Yeah, exactly.
And so what I would say is, this is a technical recommendation for all of you who are doing this with a group of learners. I would have my learners keep thesaurus.com open while they are doing this. And I tell them, look, you have that extra 700 words or whatever you need to break out. Go to the thesaurus and figure out which words can do double duty on a lot of this stuff, or triple duty. Like that words can have multiple meanings, that they can imply levels of granularity or gravity of a situation. Like they can be more dense, I guess would be the word I would apply, right? You want to be able to use language in a skillful way to make the point you need to make without having to include 5 extra paragraphs that never needed to be there. And so I always try to orient them toward concision, because it's so much more valuable to read a shorter, clear explanation than an overly verbose. And I say this as somebody who talks too much. It's not great if you have to say the 70 minutes of your job talk or whatever instead of the 20 minutes. And you can often, if you can do this well, it'll communicate to your audience that you actually understand the thing you're talking about and aren't just bullshitting. I think that's the other thing I want to caution you all about as you're listening to this is you don't want your learners to come out of this and bullshit people. You want them to be able to speak in a way or write in a way that's going to communicate, hey, I actually do understand this quite well and can command language to clarify that for my audience.
Right. And I would because I think we're probably getting close to time here. The other part too with all of this language stuff is the neutral point of view thing. Is can you write without it being this was the most evil empire, cruelest people, whatever. Just be like, oh well, just explain what they did and let the reader infer whether they think that was cruel. Because I mean, again, it's one of those things that did they think they were cruel or was that their culture? Like, and why would a culture think that a practice that we see as cruel is just day to day? It's like going to the ATM. Human sacrifice is like going to the ATM, right? It's like, how would a society come to that conclusion, right? That cultural conclusion that's worth digging into, right? And like, who does that system benefit? All those kind of questions. But you can do all of that without having to have the value loaded language. And I think you do it more successfully with sort of the subtler sort of approach, telling people what it is how they should feel about something rather than just saying these are the conditions.
There are two, this is kind of a crummy place to drop this, is at the very end of an episode, but there are two principles I would often tell my students. One of them I've mentioned before, which is show, don't tell, right?
Yeah, don't creative writing.
Yeah, advice, right. Don't do exposition if you don't have to. Use other ways to kind of introduce these ideas. The other is what I used to call the sheep in the box metaphor, or the sheep in the box drawn from The Little Prince. Okay. So if you've read the short story, The Little Prince, or watched the movie adaptation of it, there's a sequence in which he's talking to the pilot and he's asking the pilot to draw him a sheep. And every time the pilot tries to draw the sheep, he does it wrong, right? The little prince says, and I'm using wrong in air quotes. So the little prince says, no, it's not right. It's too old or too sickly or whatever. And so the pilot ends up drawing a box, and then the prince says, oh, it's perfect. And the reason it's perfect is because the prince can then project onto that sheep whatever his ideal sheep is. And so I would try to get my learners to understand, like, you don't have to describe everything in great detail. There is room for imagination or creativity here. You just have to be thoughtful and strategic about where are you creating that opportunity to project onto a thing versus telling the audience exactly what this looks like. And there is a great analog in a lot of horror, right? Horror, I think, often good horror is very good at sheep in the box, whereas bad horror will show you the monster. Exactly. That's kind of the attitude you want your learners to develop, this idea that not only can they do a lot of this through showing rather than exposition, but also that often you don't really need to go into this unless there's a specific point reason you're trying to make.
Often less is more, right? When you're trying to.
Yes, exactly.
So, and that's different than efficiency, I would argue. I mean, this is like a whole other argument that we could have, a whole other podcast that we could have. To what degree is good writing, a level of efficiency, versus like just being concise, right? And using concrete terms and whatever, because nobody wants bloated anything. But on the other hand, and I've said this before in creative writing too, that if you go through and apply absolutely every rule for good writing, it feels really tight and constricted. And I'll often say constipated, like it just feels like it's too tight and it can't breathe, like a corset. You need to let it open up a little bit, and have some different techniques, and whatever. So it's not quite so, quote unquote, perfect. But I was going to say too, before we run, I thought for sure that the sheep in the box thing was going to be like some weird Scottish Highland humor. So I'm glad it turned out very differently.
Yeah, it was very different. And I think what you're describing there is pacing and flow. And maybe that's like you said, that's a separate conversation we could have another time. But there are some examples I would point to of very good writing in television, in film, in text, in graphic novels, like in games, I think, where you can have a very tight pacing that makes the thing feel like it's naturally progressing from one idea to the next at a clip that is sensible to your audience and doesn't treat them like they're stupid. And I think that's actually probably one of the biggest problems I have with modern filmmaking, at least in the era of Marvel and popcorn summer movies. It's just that the pacing is purposely drawn out to the point where this is almost borderline unwatchable because it's so slow and it's beating me over the head with an idea. And we want to get our learners away from that when they're building a meta narrative. So maybe on that note, we should end and then talk a little bit about what we'll do next time, which is the actual construction of the various categories or catalog entries that your learners will make through this process. So once they have their meta narrative, we're going to want them to go in and put some detail into the world with respect to some objects or some people or some events that are going to be unfolding in that space. And we'll get into the details of like how we think about the level of granularity you're providing for those things. I don't know if there's anything you want to add on that before we leave.
I'm excited to talk about spreadsheets.
That's who isn't?
If that
Best
doesn't get
sheets are
people to,
spreadsheets, right?
exactly, if that doesn't get people to tune into next time, I don't know
I
what
can
will.
think of two people I know who I
Yeah,
think would
they'd
be
get very
super
excited.
into that. But
Right.
yeah, looking forward to it. Thank you all for listening, and we'll be back with our episode on catalog entries very soon.
All right. See you.
Bye-bye.
The World Building Workshop podcast is a production of Trent Hergenrader and Steven Slota. Our theme song, Stompin' at Midnight, is a copyright-free Creative Commons production created by composer Kevin MacLeod. The show is mixed and edited by Steven Slota. The companion text, The World Building Workshop, Teaching Critical Thinking and Empathy Through World Modeling, Simulation, and Play, is published by the MIT Press, copyright 2025. Print copies can be purchased through the MIT Press website. The audiobook version, narrated by Steven Slota, is available at www.theworldbuildingworkshop.com.